From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump's nominee for Labor Secretary, Lori Chavez-DeRemer, testifies during her Senate confirmation hearings as Republicans press her on her support for union-favored legislation amid a debate inside the GOP about what it really means to become a party of workers. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Alicia Finley. So far, President Trump's cabinet nominees have sailed through Senate confirmation hearings with barely token dissent from the GOP, even for strange ideological bedfellows. RFK Jr. confirmed last week in a vote of 52 to 48. Tulsi Gabbard, who got through with the same tally. But are Republicans going to confirm a labor secretary who is a favorite of the teachers' unions and the Teamsters? That's the question in the Senate today, where former Congresswoman Lori Chavez-DeRemer is testifying. Her record in Congress includes sponsoring the PRO Act, which would override right-to-work laws in 26 states. Here she is at the Senate hearing explaining her past support for that bill.
I know there has been a lot of conversation about my support of the PRO Act. Like President Trump, I believe our labor laws need to be updated and modernized to reflect today's workforce and the business environment. As a member of Congress, the PRO Act was the bill to have those conversations. Conversations that matter deeply to the people of Oregon's 5th Congressional District. I recognize that bill was imperfect.
And here is the nominee tangling a little bit more on that question with members of the Senate.
The right to work is a fundamental tenet of labor laws, where states have a right to choose if they want to be a right-to-work state, and that should be protected.
PRO Act would have overturned that.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I signed on to the PRO Act because I was representing Oregon's 5th District, but I also signed on to the PRO Act because I wanted to be at that table and have those conversations. But I fully, fairly, and support states who want to protect their right to work. I have said that to every senator that I have visited.
So you no longer support the aspect of the PRO Act that would have overturned state right-to-work laws?
Yeah, there were so many parts.
That's a yes?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Monet, what do you make of that explanation? I guess a little unsurprising that President Trump's nominee for Labor Secretary is now saying that she does not, in fact, want to override right-to-work laws in more than half the states of the country, but saying that she signed on to that bill because she just wanted to be part of that conversation for the people of Oregon in her district. I wonder whether Republicans are going to find that explanation very satisfying.
Yeah, I think it's clear, as you alluded to in the beginning, that Lori Chavez-DeRemer was nominated by President Trump essentially to strike a deal with the unions who supported him more so than they had previous Republican nominees for president. And the Teamsters in particular were willing to withhold their endorsement of Kamala Harris in return for Trump's ear. And so in filling the labor secretary role, he was looking for a way to show that he was going to repay that act of loyalty. And so he picked the Republican who was the closest to what the unions would want, someone who had a record of being friendly to union priorities, and the PRO Act in particular. I think Rand Paul, who is a member of the Help Committee, of course, that heard Lori Chavez-DeRemer's hearing on Wednesday, expressed a very strong skepticism of her record and said that he was going to come out as an early no vote. And particularly the issue that he raised was right to work. That was probably the most drastic component of the PRO Act. It would have banned right to work throughout all of the states. And she seemed very willing to walk back her support for that particular provision. I think in having meetings with senators over the course of her nomination, she knows that that is a line in the sand for a lot of people who would otherwise be disposed to support her. So she was willing to backtrack a little bit. But frankly, I think it was a missed opportunity for Rand Paul to potentially pick on some of the other components of the PRO Act, because there is a whole lot in that bill, almost none of which aligns with Republican Party priorities on labor. It would, for example, enshrine California's joint employer standards. It would basically make it much easier for unions to be able to force an election without having a secret ballot and all these other provisions. So it could have been an opportunity for Rand Paul and maybe some other skeptical Republicans not only to continue to question Lori Chavez-DeRemer about right to work, but also to get her on the record about some other things that she had signed her name to during her one term in Congress and get a sense of, even if you're not willing to push on this very, very difficult priority in right to work, what areas might you find to continue building on the alliance that she's built with labor unions in the past and try to make her commit to not being willing to break with the Republican consensus in some of these areas as they prepare to potentially confirm her.
One of those other things that Lori Chavez-DeRemer signed on to during her time in Congress was a bill called the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act. Alicia, as I understand it, that is a federal bill that would have tried to enshrine a right to collective bargaining for public employees in states and localities, which sounds like an effort to undo, for example, the Act 10 reforms that were so backed by conservatives when Scott Walker pushed them across the line in Wisconsin, to require that states become more like New York and California and Illinois, really empowering the public sector unions that have helped drive those states into the fiscal problems that they now face.
Right. So this law would essentially override the collective bargaining laws in various states. It would require that government unions be allowed to collectively bargain with their employers, meaning government employers across the board. Most states already provide collective bargaining rights to government employees with some restrictions. There are only maybe a dozen or so that do not. But it would result in a lot of financial complications in those states that do not, for instance, like Florida, and more bloated government. I think, but this also underlines key problem is that the GOP or Republicans used to be very united on a lot of these labor issues and being anti, or I don't want to say anti, it's not anti-union per se, but they were much more pro-worker, flexibility, freedom, and this extends to both the private and public unions. But you're starting to see some cracks in that, and that's where the Trump administration, J.D. Vance and some others are kind of headed, is they're becoming much more pro-union. They're trying to make this seem like an alliance with the working men of the country by taking on or by appointing Lori Chavez and championing some of these other causes. You saw that with the quote-unquote Social Security Fairness Act of last year that provided increased benefits to government workers that really was not merited. The Republicans largely supported that bill under the guise of that, we're just helping support workers, when really this was a bill that empowered the government unions and it essentially disproportionately gave them benefits that private sector workers didn't deserve. And there's also longstanding divisions between the government workers and private sector unions, but the Democrats have tried to kind of paper over those divides and say, we're just one big happy family. But the reality is, and this gets to the point about the government collective bargaining, is that when you make the public sector bigger, when you provide all these benefits and rewards to the public sector unions, those have to be funded by taxpayers, which inevitably end up hurting private sector workers, some of which are unionized. So there is, to some extent, is a zero-sum game.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back.
President Trump has been leading that charge. Another place that I would point to is his intervention in the dispute between the East Coast longshoremen and the ports. Remember, in December, he was posting on Truth Social that there's discussion having to do with automation on United States docks. The amount of money saved is nowhere near the distress, hurt, and harm it causes for American workers. Basically intervening in that dispute on the side of the longshoremen union. But Monet, it's striking to me that there is this new debate within the Republican Party about whether unions are the key to becoming a workers' party, attracting more support from blue-collar employees. And simultaneously, the number of workers in the United States who are members of unions has never never been lower in the data that we have on record going back decades. The Labor Department had a report out last month where it went through the numbers, and in the public sector, government employees, about a third of them overall in the United States are union members. But in the private economy, it is 5.9%. So if you take 100 workers across the United States working for various companies in the private economy, 96% of them are not members of a union. Those kind of numbers hold even for the kind of job, occupations, industries that you typically think of as being union dominated. So digging into this Bureau of Labor Statistics data, in manufacturing industry, it says, in the manufacturing industry, only 7.8% of the people employed there are members of unions. In construction, 10.3%. So, Monet, Republicans have decided that this shrinking pool of voters is the place to go fish when 9 out of 10, even construction workers, are not members of a union in this day and age.
Well, I think that the Republican party's and Trump's preoccupation with courting unions is a political blunder for a couple of reasons. One, as you mentioned, is that they are shrinking as a share of the voting population, and that's a long-standing trend. Of course, they reached their high point as a share of the workforce in the 1950s, and it's been declining ever since. And again, that's by the free choice of millions of Americans who are not opting to join these unions that have tried to expand into new sectors like the Southern automakers and like a lot of retail service industries have failed to actually convince workers in these places to adopt the union by and large because they don't think that they're going to get benefits in terms of pay, in terms of job protections that are commensurate with the dues that the unions are asking them to pay. And also, they often don't share the political priorities of these unions, which tend to be very progressive. So another reason why it's a mistake is that these private unions don't really seem to have the ability to actually deliver their voters to vote in the way that they choose. There's a lot of variety in the political views, even among workers who are unionized. And we saw that with the Teamsters over the course of the past year. They took a couple of internal polls trying to gauge which candidate their members support. And Trump came out favored in some of those polls. They had to try to retest it to see if they could get a slightly different result. But Sean O'Brien, who himself still leans Democratic, that's the Teamsters president, doesn't reflect the political outlook of the majority of his members who are these union workers in trucking industries. I think Trump achieved a much better balance in his first term in terms of how to appeal to these types of workers. And that was, instead of intervening on the side of workers against their employers, he often would take the side of both the employers and the workers against federal regulators who were trying to regulate their businesses out of existence. For example, look at the way that he attended a protest of UAW workers. While President Biden, for example, went to the UAW workers and said, we're going to make sure that you get a better deal out of these automakers, explicitly taking the side of the workers, Trump talked about how the electric vehicle mandates were ruining prospects for the workers, had led to plant closures, and that he was going to reverse that as president. So essentially, he's saying, I want to take positions that strengthen both the business itself and the employees by deregulating, as opposed to saying, I want to push the prospects of union workers at the expense of employers in a way that's going to be damaging to both in the long run.
Monet mentions these unsuccessful pushes by unions, especially in southern states. And there was another example recently. Over the weekend, the results came in on an effort to organize a North Carolina Amazon warehouse. The current pay there, according to some of the news reports, is about $18 to $24 an hour. The union says that they want to push that to $30 an hour, wants longer lunch breaks, and so forth. But the result, Alicia, is pretty remarkable. Apparently, more than 4,000 people are employed at this warehouse. And here is the vote as announced by the National Labor Relations Board. 2,447 against to 829 for unionizing. So it was a 75% to 25% vote, roughly, which is a very interesting result. And the union is saying that this is because of relentless illegal efforts to intimidate us. But Alicia, that to me sounds like the typical excuse and the kind of arguments that you hear from union organizers. This is why we need things like the PRO Act. This is why we need more legislation to make the unionizing process easier.
Right. And my concern is that now the NLRB is really the agency that's in charge of arbitrating labor disputes between employers like Amazon and unions and overseeing those union elections. So that's where a lot of the power and clout lies. But that doesn't mean that she won't have influence. Namely, they oversee the Labor Department that includes OSHA. And what labor unions like to do is they like to file safety complaints against employers, or they file complaints against employers for not paying, or what they call wage theft, not paying workers for certain breaks and et cetera. And they like to use these complaints as leverage in their campaigns to organize workers, essentially just to bully the employers. And what you've seen in the past is with Democratic labor secretaries that they have ruled in favor of the unions and ordered the companies to pay up. So that's one place where I would have concerns with Lori Chavez. She also has oversight over some various rules like the independent contractor rule, which the Biden administration imposed. Basically, I think Nominee kind of alluded to this, that it would eliminate independent contracting, most gig worker relationships. Now, the Trump acting labor secretary has said that they are not going to defend it, but that doesn't mean that they won't go try to make some halfway house or middle ground with some other kind of rule. Similarly, with an overtime rule that the Biden administration did, that went even much further than what the Obama administration did on this, increased the exemption for salaried workers such that if you earn less than $58,656, you are entitled to overtime. You're essentially a wage earner, even if you are salaried, compared to that would be up from $35,568. So that's a pretty major increase. Now, what they may end up doing is maybe she'll reduce that 58, so it's not 58,000, but it's still maybe 50,000, which would still be a pretty big increase. I mean, one thing employers have generally supported is trying to index it and do it for different regions. So, that the overtime threshold would be different for a worker in the South than for, a worker in New York, just because the cost of living is different. But raising it across the board into the 50s would be prohibitively expensive for many employers. One other thing she has oversight over is some guest worker visas. And we know unions are very opposed to these programs. And so she would have capacity to at least limit them or make the process for employers to get them very burdensome. Again, this is supported by many Republicans, too. And so I think that that's something else you should watch out for.